Okay. Well, today I want to continue, and this will be our second session as we look at poetry, specifically Hebrew poetry. And last session we talked about just some of the basics, overview of poetry, and I think we ended that time talking about. I mentioned to you three elements, key elements that we see in Hebrew poetry. If we were to look at like Western poetry, we would say the elements would be, in Western poetry would be, what would be some elements that we find, or characteristics, maybe that's a better word, of English poetry? What are things that are typical in English or Western poetry? What do you guys...
They have rhythm.
Yeah, rhyme, right?
Rhyme, yes.
Rhyming. Rhyme. So words that rhyme, that's very common. Any other characteristics in Western poetry?
Meter.
Yeah, there's meter. Right, we see that a lot in, many songs actually are poems, right? Just being sung. And you'll see that there'll be a meter, there'll be the syllables in each line typically will match. There'll be rhyming, usually the end of the line is typical. Any other features of English or Western poetry? Figurative language, right?
Yeah.
Words that don't carry their literal meaning, but mean something else. All right, that's very common in Western poetry. There's also a structure. If you go back in time even to poems from Shakespeare, there's the iambic pentameter is one form of structure. There's the soliloquies. There's various categories of types of poems as well. Now in Hebrew poetry, some of these elements exist in Hebrew poetry, but there really are three key elements or characteristics of Hebrew poetry. And as I ended last time, they are these three: terseness, structure, and imagery. All right. Hebrew poetry will contain these three characteristics. And by terseness, that word just simply means brief, short statements, an economy of words in order to express a thought or idea. Structure has the idea of the poems are intentionally structured in a certain way, and there's two major forms of structure. The most common structure is what's called parallelism. That's what we're going to focus our attention on this morning. And then also acrostics, and I'll explain what those are when we get to them. And finally, imagery. Imagery is probably the main component of Hebrew poetry. You'll see it in all Hebrew poetry, and it's really pictures that are drawn with words. That does include figurative language, but that language is used to develop a picture in the reader's mind in order to evoke or promote or bring about emotion. And we talked about that last time we met, that poems are a way to stir emotions. And one key way to do that is by using imagery, so that not only are you hearing those words, but as you hear them, you're able to, in your mind, form a picture. All right, so poetry can be very powerful in how it can stimulate or stir the emotions. All right, so all of these things are intended to stir the emotions as truth is conveyed. Again, Hebrew poetry is not just intended to stir emotion just to stir emotion. The intent is to convey biblical truth in a way that stirs the emotion, right? There's a difference. Okay, it's not just bringing emotion so that someone can feel that emotion. It's the intent is to communicate a biblical truth in a way that will encourage that emotion. Okay, so those are three. We're going to see these over and over, so I'm bringing them up now. Just keep these in mind: terseness, structure, imagery. Those are the characteristics of Hebrew poetry. All right. Now, when we talk about, again, what we mean here is brevity. It's short. It's pithy. It's what would be another way to say it? Compact. All right. For example, Alan, I'm gonna have you read the first three verses of this well-known poem in Hebrew poetry. Can you read Psalm 23? Those three verses.
Verses 1 to 3, Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake.
So do you notice something here, guys? Notice these lines are short. They're simple statements or simple phrases or clauses that develop a picture, right? The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. All of these are short statements. Now, in epistles or in narrative text, usually there'll be these long descriptive sentences, but poetic passages are the words are chosen carefully, and it uses a minimal amount of words. Again, because part of the reason is that produces or encourages emotion or emphasis. All right, it's intentional like that. Well, so here we have an example where these short statements, but still even in them, this picture is being drawn of what? What's the picture here? Alan, you just read this, so maybe you can comment. What is the picture that the poet here, who is David, is drawing with? What's the imagery here that we see?
Agriculture or farming.
Yeah, there's
shepherding.
Yeah, what scene, if you were to what scene is David painting here?
It's a flock of sheep with a shepherd.
Yeah, and where's the sheep? David, in this case, the author, right? The Lord is my shepherd. Where is he being? It's not just a picture of sheep, but what else is around the sheep?
It's a green pasture. It's a rich environment.
Yes. The idea of you picture the sheep being led by a shepherd into a meadow with water and grass, and it's protected and it's peaceful, right? That's the image here. And he presents that image by these short statements, again, which tend to be impactful. All right. So that's terseness. And we're going to see that in much of Hebrew poetry. Not all Hebrew poetry is short statements, but much of it is, especially in the Psalms. We will see that. All right. Now, the second element, and this is where we are going to camp out. We're going to spend some time here this session and probably some next session on parallelism. Parallelism. And now, the word parallel means two lines that are pointed in the same direction. They're parallel to each other. Hebrew poetry has this element in much of it. Not all Hebrew poetry, but much of Hebrew poetry contains this type of structure called parallelism. And what this simply means is just that the parallelism is really the relationship between two lines in a verse of a poem. Much of Hebrew poetry is constructed with two lines per verse. 2 lines for each verse. And parallelism is this concept whereby each of those lines are connected to each other in a certain way. All right. Or let me show you an example of this. Psalm 19, verses 1 and 2. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. Now, if we take apart these 2 verses, I want you to notice something. Notice verse 1. There are 2 lines here. The heavens are telling of the glory of God is the first line. Their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. That is the second line. And these 2 lines are parallel to each other. That is, they're presenting the same idea or concept. They're just wording it in a little bit different way. In this case, it's synonymous parallelism. And that is, notice, the heavens are telling. And then the second line, their expanse is declaring. Okay, that's the same idea. The glory of God in the first line, the work of his hands in the second line. These are 2 lines which are essentially focusing on the same idea. And by way of repetition, they're presenting that idea in a poetic fashion. We see the same thing in verse 2. Day to day pours forth speech. Night to night reveals knowledge. See how there's a parallel idea here? The first line says day to day. All right, the next line says night to night. So it's speaking of the 2 different parts of the day. But notice after that, pours forth speech, reveals knowledge. Those are a similar idea. So again, we see in verse 2, the repetition. Again, this is a form of what's called synonymous parallelism. So parallelism, you could think of it this way, is parallelism in Hebrew poetry. Again, we're not talking about mathematics, Sid. All right. So we're not looking at 2 parallel lines, no geometry here. All right. So don't think that way. But parallelism in Hebrew poetry describes the relationship between 2 lines within a verse. Okay. Now, most of the verses in Psalms and Proverbs contain parallelism. All right, not all, but most of them. I don't know the percentage, but it will be by far the majority of verses that you see in the Psalms or verses you see in the Proverbs. You will find parallelism. Now, Hebrew poetry is also found in other books of the Bible, such as the prophets or parts of some of the other books, like the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy or Miriam's song in Exodus. So there is Hebrew poetry all throughout the Bible. It's concentrated, of course, in Psalms and Proverbs, but we also see it in many other books. The book of Habakkuk is all Hebrew poetry. Hosea contains a large amount of Hebrew poetry. Isaiah, a lot of Hebrew poetry. Jeremiah, all the prophets, most of them anyway, not Jonah. Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. All right, so Job. Hebrew poetry is found in much of the Bible, but not all of it has parallelism. Much of it does, most of the Psalms and Proverbs, but not every passage in Hebrew poetry has parallelism. But it's such a dominant feature in Hebrew poetry that we're going to cover that and spend some time on it, because as we do, it helps us to better understand what the author is saying. All right, and hopefully we'll see that as we go forward in looking at parallelism. But just think of parallelism as, again, 2 lines here, and those 2 lines have a special connection, a special relationship. All right, now there are different ways or different kinds of relationships, different types of parallelism. All right, so let's cover some of those. There's several distinct types of parallelism in Hebrew poetry. Before we look at them, are there any questions so far? Is this a new concept for any of you? Are you all familiar? Have you heard of parallelism in Hebrew poetry? Maybe just let me know by show of hands that if you've heard of this before, you're familiar with it. If not, that's okay. A couple of you? All right.
Just from the reading, Pastor Tim.
Okay.
I encounter it from the reading.
Okay, that's fine. I wanted to have an idea of who is familiar with it. It's for many, when I studied poetry in seminary, it was kind of a new concept for me. I hadn't really heard of it or thought of it before, but as it was taught to me, and as I see it now when I study in poems, it's a very helpful feature to understand, because it will open up, help you to open up the meaning to you, kind of like block diagram or structural diagrams do. It forces us to think about more how these lines are connected to each other. What's the connection? And we do that by noting what type of parallelism we have here. So the most, probably the most common parallelism, and we saw it in the example from Psalm 19, is what is called synonymous parallelism. Again, synonym, right? Synonym is basically the same idea or same meaning. Synonymous means that one line repeats the idea of the other, both in meaning and in form. All right, grammatically and in concept. Let me show you. Proverbs 16:18. All right, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. Now notice here, the idea is very similar between these two lines, but also the way the idea is presented is similar. We have here pride, okay, in the first line. The second line, a haughty spirit. That's the same idea, right? Haughty, proud, that's the same. Those are synonyms of each other. Goes before destruction. Second line, before stumbling. Before is the same meaning, same word. Destruction is a similar in meaning to stumbling. All right. They're not the same word, but there's the same idea. And notice even the grammar is the same. The subjects are synonymous. The verbal idea is synonymous, goes before, and then the object is synonymous, are synonymous. You see that? So that's why this is called synonymous parallelism. It is basically not only the same idea being repeated, but it's being repeated even in the same grammatical form by use of synonyms. Let's look at another example that we just saw before a moment ago. Day to day. All right, that's the subject. Oops, I couldn't. Day to day. Yes.
Observation, there is no verb in the second line.
It's implied. Yeah, that's another type of, we're going to see this in Hebrew poetry. It's called ellipsis, and that is where the author intentionally removes a word that is still implied to be there. Okay? We will see this a lot in poetry. This is done because in order to maintain the terseness, right, the shortness, sometimes the authors will take out words, but they're still intended to be there. The idea is still there. So he could have literally said, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit goes before stumbling. But a lot of times they'll just take out certain words because it's redundant, and it's more poetic, it's more artistic to leave them out. Okay, so that's a good observation that you noticed there, and we'll see that quite a bit. All right. And technically, actually, in this verse, notice the word goes is italicized. Do you guys remember what that means? The New American Standard.
It's not there in the original manuscript.
Yeah, it's not in the original. So really, the original would be pride before destruction and a haughty spirit before stumbling. Okay. That's the literal. If we were to take the Hebrew words, that would be the most literal translation. Now the NAS put, The New American Standard put goes before in order to give it a verbal idea, but they really, to keep the original author's, the way he stated it, we really should say just pride before destruction, a haughty spirit before stumbling. And notice that brevity really emphasizes the nature of what he's saying here. Okay. All right, good observation. Any other questions on that one or comments? Let's look at Psalm 19, verse 2. This is another example of what we call synonymous parallelism. All right, where notice day to day pours forth speech, night to night reveals knowledge. So we have day to day. That's the subject. Pours forth is the verb, the verbal idea, and speech is the object in the first line. Notice the second line. Night to night is the subject. Reveals is the verb, and knowledge is the object. Now notice, again, these aren't the same exact words, but the idea is similar and the grammatical structure is the same. Day to day is not the same thing as night to night, but it's still in the same category, right? It's speaking of time or time of day. Day to day, every day in the day pours forth speech, and every night in the night reveals knowledge. So the subject is parallel, pours forth and reveals. Those are similar ideas, similar verbal ideas. So they are synonymous with each other. And then speech and knowledge. Again, not the exact same thing, but the concept, the idea is similar. And the grammatical structure is similar. All right? So this is why it's called synonymous parallelism. Now, if the author had said something like this, day to day pours forth speech, and in the nighttime, we learn things. We learn truth. Let's put it that way. Now here, it's different. The second line has a different concept or idea than the first. The first line is saying that something is revealing, is speaking, but the second line is talking about we're learning something. So they're connected, but in a different way, not in a synonymous way here. Okay? So that's the difference. This is another kind of parallelism that we'll talk about in a moment. But right now, I just want you to focus on the first one is synonymous parallelism. Again, that's going to be the most common type of parallelism, where again, the ideas between each line are the same and the grammatical structure of each line is the same. Or maybe I should say similar, right? Okay? So that's synonymous parallelism. If there's no questions, I'll move to the second. Any questions on that, on the synonymous parallelism or on these two passages? All right. Let's look at contrastive. Contrastive, that's another kind of parallelism, and that is where one line contrasts the other. That is, they present opposite ideas. Okay? This too is a very common form of Hebrew parallelism, especially in the Proverbs, by the way. So, for example, notice here, the house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. So here, notice a couple of things. One is we have a grammatical similarity here. Notice the house of the wicked versus the tent. Okay? And the house of the wicked, the tent of the upright will be destroyed, and then the second line will flourish. Now, do you notice something? Notice the grammatical structure is similar. We have a subject, a verb, and an object, but the concepts are contrasting. The subject is the same, the house and the tent, but notice it's the house of the wicked in the first line, but it's the tent of the upright in the second. Those are opposites, correct? Diba? Right? The wicked and the upright. And then notice the verb will be destroyed in the first line, will flourish in the second line. Again, opposites. The grammatical structure is very similar between the two lines, but the concept is opposite or contrasting. And that's, of course, why we call it contrastive parallelism. So there's a parallelism here where the lines are constructed in a very similar way. The house of the wicked, the tent of the upright will be destroyed, will flourish. But the concepts are opposite. They contrast. And so oftentimes we will see this word here, but, in the second line, because it's forming a contrast with the first. All right, let's look at one more example. The wages, okay, of the righteous is life. All right, is life. The income, okay, that's similar to wages, right? The income of the wicked, punishment. All right, there's a couple things to notice here. One, we have the wages, the income. But notice the wages of the righteous in the first line, the income of the wicked in the second line. Again, opposites. Is life in the first line, and then the second line, punishment. Now notice the second line does not contain that word is, because Sid's going to see this right away, so I'm just going to beat him to it. But it's implied in the second line. The idea is there, but the word is not included because of this idea of brevity, but it's still the concept is similar. And notice life is the opposite of punishment. Now, he didn't say death. He could have, but it's still in the realm of ideas. You know, punishment, violence, death is all in the same category, and you have life, blessing on the other side. So again, notice, even though there's no word but here at the beginning, it's still contrasting because it's contrasting the wages of the righteous versus the income of the wicked. All right? So again, grammatical similarity, simple subject, and then notice the wages of the righteous, and then the second line is the income of the wicked, and then we have the verbal is life and is punishment. All right? So grammatically similar, but the concept is contrasting. Okay, so that's contrastive parallelism, where one line contrasts the first. In synonymous parallelism, both lines are basically the same idea. In contrastive, they are opposing or opposite ideas. All right, questions? Okay.
Pastor Tim,
Yes, Sid.
the explicit contrast is righteous and wicked.
The explicit contrast is the wages of what the righteous receives versus what the wicked receives. Okay. All right. Third type of parallelism, and this one now we're going to get a little more complicated in this one, so we'll spend a little time on it. The third type is what is called developmental parallelism, and that simply means this: the one line, usually the second, develops the other line. That is, one line is not synonymous or contrastive. It's not grammatically similar to the first line, but it adds to or illustrates or gives the result of. So let me show you some examples. There's three kinds of developmental parallelism. Okay. The first kind is what we would call expansion. It expands or adds. So for example, the heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. Now here, these are not synonymous, but in this case, the second line is adding to or developing the first. It's giving more information. Okay? Here it's talking about the heart knows its own bitterness. But notice the second line doesn't match. And a stranger, okay, that's not similar to heart, does not share its joy. All right. So here, notice what's happening is there's more information being added to the first line by the second. And the translation, notice the word and there also kind of helps us realize that this is not, the second line isn't saying the same thing as the first. All right. It's adding to the first. So the heart knows its own bitterness. And in addition to that, a stranger does not share the heart's joy. Okay. So conceptually, he's talking about what that, we know what's in our own hearts, or we experience our own, we understand best what we are experiencing, but he doesn't say that in a synonymous way or contrastive way. He says it in a way that where the second line develops the first. It adds to it in this case, or expands upon the idea of the first line. Often you will see the conjunction and when developmental parallel, when expansion or addition is happening. All right. Now there's a second kind of developmental parallelism, and this kind is explains or illustrates. Let me give you an example of this. Psalm 42, verse 1. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. So notice here, the first line is an illustration. It's a picture of the second. All right. His statement here is, my soul pants for you, O God. That's the concept. And in the first line, he's giving really a picture or an illustration of that. All right, or an explanation. So we have a better idea. My soul pants for you. In what way does it pant for you? Well, like a deer that pants for the water brooks. Okay, that's a picture. That's an illustration. And in this case, the first line is illustrating the second. Sometimes it's the other way around. He could have said, my soul pants for you, O God, like the deer pants for the water brooks. All right, that would be the same, where in that case the second line would be developing the first. Okay, another example. The refining pot is for silver and the furnace is for gold, but the Lord tests the hearts. Now we might say, oh, I see the word but there. This must be contrastive. Well, hold on a minute. Contrastive, remember, will have both lines will be grammatically similar and there'll be a contrasting idea. But here, notice it says the refining pot is, so we have the refining pot is for silver, and there's actually two subjects here. The furnace for gold. Then we have is for silver, for gold. Those are on the same line though. But the second line is the Lord, different subject, tests, different verbal idea, hearts. Oops, I should have done it this way. Okay, so this is not synonymous parallelism, and it's not contrastive. The second line is different than the first. It's explaining, or the first line's explaining the second, or giving a picture. right? The Lord tests the hearts. But the first line is a picture of the refining. It's an illustration of refining, right? When you heat up silver and gold, what happens? The impurities rise to the top, the dross, and you clear it off. But when you put gold or silver in a pot and heat it up, the purer it is, then the less less dross you will see, right? If it's very pure gold, you won't see much on the surface. If it's very impure gold, you'll see a lot of junk on the surface. Well, the Lord tests the hearts. That's the idea here, and he's giving a picture of just like when you test gold or silver by heating it up. All right. So again, we have this idea or concept of one line adding to, in this case, illustrating the other. All right. Let me go through the third kind of developmental parallelism, and then if you guys have any questions, we'll come back to that, okay? So far, we've seen two kinds. There's the expand or add, where one line expands or adds upon the other. And then the second kind is explain or illustrate. That is where one line provides an explanation or an illustration of the other. All right. A third kind of developmental parallelism is called it's a reason or a result. That is, one line gives the reason or the result of the other line. For example, Proverbs 14:7 gives the instruction, leave the presence of a fool, all right, or you will not discern words of knowledge. Okay, now notice here the sorry, I'm getting this. Notice, for example, we do not have synonymous or contrastive parallelism here. The grammatical structure of each line is different. The first line is a command, imperative, you leave the presence of a fool. The second line gives you the reason for that. If you don't, basically, then you'll become foolish too. You will lack discernment. If you do not leave the presence of a fool, then you will become like him, is the idea. You too will not have discernment or understanding of truth. All right. So in this case, the second line gives the reason for the first. That's why it's called developmental. The second line is developing the first line, and the way it develops in this case is by telling us the reason for the first line. Okay? So those are the three kinds of developmental. We have expands, explains, or reason or result. All right. Any question on this third kind of parallelism? This is the harder type of parallelism to identify. You guys have any questions or comments? The important thing I want you to see here is that in Hebrew poetry, parallelism is the tight connection between the two lines in the verse. Okay? They're not, these two lines are specifically chosen. They're not just random statements. The author is intentionally connecting these two lines. It's very typical. Yes.
What is this? How did you name this kind of parallelism? This is what?
Oh, developmental.
Developmental. Is it the same thing as identified here in our reading, progressive parallelism?
Yeah, I think progressive is another name for it.
Okay. So, but they're the same.
Yeah, conceptually,
basically
the idea. Same. Yeah, the idea is one line is progressive means to sort of make progress, to continue further. And developmental is that idea. It's continuing the idea further.
Okay, thanks.
Either by adding to it, or illustrating it, or giving the reason or result of it. Okay? So yeah, we could call it, yeah, I'm sorry for the different terms. I forgot about that. But yeah, progressive. Again, the idea of moving forward, moving something forward, making progress, right? That's to move something forward. That's the idea here. I like developmental better because I think it's more accurate.
It's easier.
Yeah, I think it's easier, and it's more accurate because it's developing. One line's developing the other, and there are different ways that you can develop it. You can develop it by adding, or by explaining, or by the reason or result.
Development is a daily word used, not progressive. Progressive is seldom and more technical in writing.
Yes, I agree. That's why I went with developmental. And I think even synonymous, there's other words for synonymous. It's like, what was it? Synthetic, I think. I don't know if you saw that in your reading. Did you guys see that? I think it's in the reading or other, you might see this, so I'll just let you know the terms just so you're, sometimes you'll see synonymous, which I think is the simplest, but other people sometimes will call it synthetic. Or contrastive, you might see some people describe it as antithetical. And then developmental, you might see it described as progressive. But the words on the right, I think, are more technical, and they're not as clear. Synonymous, I think of synonym, right? Contrastive, I think of contrast. And then developmental, I think of you developing something. So we're going to go with the ones on the left because I think those are more easily to understand. Okay?
Pastor Tim.
Yeah, because of
synonymous or similar.
Yeah, similar. And keep in mind, it's similar in idea. You'll see the synonyms there, but also similar in grammar, the grammatical structure. Notice, for example, the grammatical structure in this last example here in Proverbs 14:7 is different between the lines. The first line is an imperative plus an object. The second line is we have a subject and then an indicative. You guys remember? And then an object. And it's the first line is, so the first line is a command, the second line is a statement. All right, that's different. This is not synonymous here. That's one clue. And again, the other is just think about what's being said. These aren't two similar ideas. What he's saying is he's making this declaration or instruction, and then the second line he's making a statement. Do this or else this will happen. Okay, that's why this is developmental. The second line develops the first by telling us the result. This will be the result. If you don't do the first line, the result is the second line. We see a lot of that in Proverbs.
Sometimes,
yeah.
All the way you are sharing that, I appreciate that, because long before I understand that you cannot just get one line stand by its own. It is very dangerous to do that, like Proverbs 16:4. I believe all of us familiar with that. The Lord has made everything for its purpose, and he stopped there. But he did not continue the verb. Then in the continuation, actually, even the wicked for the day of judgment or trouble. how I appreciate your explanation this morning. The important to identify the similarities and the development of the. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, that's a great example, actually. So knowing that in Hebrew poetry you have parallelism, that tells you you can't separate two lines in a verse. They're interconnected. Just like, I think that's what you were saying, right, Noor? Yeah. So that's very important. Here's another example, I think, that shows us the value of understanding this concept of parallelism. In Psalms 1, verse, the last verse of the Psalm is, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Okay, maybe I should, let me give this example in a minute, because there's something here that, so I'm going to put it down here. I'm going to come back to this, because Noor brings up a very important point that I can make more clearly, I think, in a minute, if I show you one more example, and then we'll come back to that. Okay. There's one other kind of special case of parallelism that's called a chiasm. Perhaps you've heard of this word before. It actually comes from the Greek letter chi, and chi is shaped like an X, okay, in Greek. And that's what a chiasm is structurally. It's kind of like an X. For example, Psalm 51 verse 1 is an example of chiasm here. And chiasm is simply to, it's a form of, let me just write it out, a form of synonymous parallelism where the second line is in reverse order grammatically compared to the first. So the lines are synonymous, parallel synonymously. They're presenting the same idea, and the grammar structure is similar, but not exactly the same, because the second line is grammatically reversed compared to the first. So let me show you Psalm 51:1. Actually, the verse reads like this. Be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness. Okay? And then the second line is this. According to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions. Okay? So, if we are to look at this line, notice a couple of things. Notice, be gracious to me, O God. So be gracious is an imperative. To me, the object of the grace, O God, according to your loving kindness. And then notice the second line, according to the greatness of your compassion. Blot out sorry about this. A little slow here. My transgressions. Okay, there is a parallel idea or similar idea between each of these two lines. The first line he's saying, be gracious to me. The second line he's saying, blot out my transgressions. The first line he says, according to your loving kindness. The second line, according to the greatness of your compassion. These are synonymous ideas between the two lines, but there's a significant difference. The second line starts with, according to your great compassion. The first line ends with, according to your loving kindness. So the author has intentionally switched the order of the second line. It's still synonymous, but he's flipped it. All right. So you'll see this sometimes where I just changed I indented that second line. Be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness. And then the second line begins with, according to the greatness of your compassion. It's a chiasm in that these two lines here are, in a sense, the chiasm points to them. Okay, the verse begins and ends with the same idea. And then in the middle, that second line is reversed so that he's basically repeating according to twice here. Your loving kindness in one line, your compassion in the other. And he does that for this reason. A chiasm, whenever you see this, you'll see the second line reverse compared to the first, and that is in order to emphasize what was reversed. So in this first verse, he's emphasizing God's loving kindness and compassion. And we know that, again, remember we talk about authorial intent. What does the author intend? Well, here in Hebrew poetry, the author's giving us a direct signal that he's emphasizing something. All right? This wasn't accidental that he reversed the order of the words in the second line. He did it on purpose. This is a fairly common form of what you'll see in Hebrew poetry, where this chiasm, and here it's done in order to emphasize the part that's being reversed. Okay? Because he could have said this. He could have said, be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness, blot out my transgressions according to the greatness of your compassion. Okay? That would be a simple synonymous parallelism. But he doesn't do that. He actually, it's synonymous, but he takes that second line and flips it. And he's basically doing that in order to, like I said, emphasize this. So it's kind of like you could see this. It's like adding exclamation points in parentheses here. That's the idea. There's emphasis on that part that's flipped. Why does this matter? Who cares? What's the significance? The significance is this, guys. Whenever the author points you to something he's trying to emphasize, then that is something you need to emphasize. And here, in this first line, the emphasis is on God's character. Right? He's basically asking for forgiveness, right? That God would forgive him, that God would show mercy, that he would wipe away his sins. And the emphasis here in this line is on the character of God as the basis for this request. Because you are loving, you're full of loving kindness, because you have great compassion, forgive me. All right? And what's very interesting, men, probably won't get to it this morning, but next time we gather, an exercise I'm going to give you in our discussion is going to be Psalm 51. And you're going to find a number of those verses are chiasms. And it makes sense because that's a highly, highly emotional poem where David's bearing his heart, right, in despair. And so there's a lot of emotion. Chiasm is a way for him to express the emphasis, the emotional emphasis that he was feeling. It's a way to show us, the reader, that emotion and emphasis, okay? Now, there are different ways that the poets do this. They can do it by repetition. They can do it by, there's some other forms of poetic devices they can use that I'll show you. But one of them I'm showing you right here is chiasm, this parallelism, but where they reverse the second line relative to the first, okay? Now, I brought that up because this verse I want to show you, to go back to Noor's point a moment ago. The Lord knows the way of the righteous. But notice here, the way of the wicked will perish. You guys see anything here as far as the structure? This is Psalm 1:6, by the way. Notice it's reversed, isn't it? The way of the righteous, the way of the wicked. There's focus, there's emphasis on that. And that makes sense, because the whole psalm really is, here's what the righteous does. He doesn't stand in the counsel of wicked or sit in the seat of scoffers. His delight's in the law of the Lord. And then in verse 4, he turns attention to, but the way the wicked are not so. They are like the chaff which the wind drives away. So this whole psalm is a contrast between the wicked, the way of the wicked, and the way of the righteous. And so the last verse is sort of emphasizing, okay, here's kind of the end statement about the way of the righteous versus the way of the wicked. And so he uses a chiasm here to draw attention to the emphasis that that's what he's contrasting. And then notice what Noor said earlier, so important that we understand the point he was making. Because we know there's Hebrew parallelism here, we know each line here is connected. There's a close relationship. And in this case, that relationship is a contrast. What's being contrasted? Anyone want to tell me? What's being contrasted in this verse?
The way.
The way of the righteous and the way of the wicked.
Yes. And again, that's the chiasm. So the focus here is that contrast. The contrast is the way of the righteous versus the way of the wicked. The way of the wicked. And I'll say, notice chiasm to emphasize this contrast. All right, so that's one thing we see, so that we know, as you're preaching this psalm, you know with confidence this last verse, the author's really emphasizing the two ways as a contrast. How do I know that he's really emphasizing it? Because he uses a chiasm. Okay, that's one thing. The second is this. Because we're dealing here with, in this case, he's contrasting two ideas. What are the two things he's contrasting? The way of the wicked and the way of the righteous. But what else is being contrasted here? See that? Very interesting thing to think about. What is as we think of things from a spiritual point of view, what is eternal life?
Knowing God.
Yes. Where do we see that?
17, John 17.
Verse
John
1.
17:3, right?
3, yes.
himself said, "This is eternal life,
Eternal life.
that they may know
Know
you and Jesus Christ, whom."
whom you have sent.
Okay, well, here Jesus defines eternal life. Okay, what is the opposite of eternal life, right? We could go to another verse. Whoever believes in him will not,
Sorry.
but will have.
Eternal life.
Now, that what Jesus said here, and he's the one who said both these statements in John, he already said that 1,000 years earlier. Look at the contrast. The opposite of perish is relationship with God. To know him. Or in this case, the Lord knows you. But it's the same idea, right? It's the idea of having a relationship with God. What's the opposite of a relationship with God? Perishing. So by knowing that there's parallelism here in this verse, what we see here, what's being contrasted? Well, the way of the righteous, the Lord knows there's a relationship, there's intimacy there. The way of the wicked, they perish. That's the opposite.
Sir
Right?
Tim,
Yeah.
in Matthew 7, it also says, the Lord declares to those who
I do not know you.
who just use his name, I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me.
Yeah.
You workers of lawlessness.
Yeah.
The way of the wicked.
And that's even similar to, was it 2 Thessalonians 1:9, I think? These will pay the penalty of eternal destruction, is the word used there, away from the presence of the Lord and the glory of his power. Similar idea, right? Apart from God, no relationship with God. That's what ultimately what perishing is. You don't, perish is not ceasing to exist, right? It's not the end. To perish, biblically speaking, means to have no relationship with God. To not be known by him or to know him.
It's great.
Pastor Tim, is it parallel to the word separation? No relationship is parallel to separation.
Yeah, I think so. That's part of the concept. That's why here in 2 Thessalonians 1:9, these will pay the penalty of what? Eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord. So yeah, separation. So that concept is actually right here in Psalm 1:6. And we know that concept is there because we know that the Lord knows is being contrasted with will perish. Right? Again, contrasting parallelism is there's two opposites. The way of the wicked versus the way of the righteous. Those are being contrasted. In the way of the righteous, the Lord knows. But the way of the wicked will perish. Okay? So this goes back to, I think, what Nor was saying earlier from Proverbs 16:4 is that we understand that within a verse in Hebrew poetry, each of those lines are connected together in some way. They have a relationship with each other. So we can't separate their concept, what they're teaching. They have to be understood together. All right? And they could be understood together in either synonymous parallelism, that they're saying the same thing, contrastive parallelism, that they're giving a contrast, saying the opposite of something, or developmental, that one line is developing the other in some way. It's either adding to it, illustrating it, or giving the reason or result. And then a chiasm here is just a special form of synonymous or contrastive parallelism. In Psalm 1:6, it's contrastive. But the second line is reversed compared to the first. Second line has the way of the wicked, and the first line ends with the way of the righteous. Okay? So there's really three major types of parallelism: synonymous, contrastive, developmental. Chiasm's a special case. You could call it a fourth form, but it's usually synonymous, sometimes contrastive. All right, and there's one more category, which I think you see in your notes. You're reading, it might be called formal or miscellaneous. It's basically, I have no idea. Ambut. Okay. So we'll call it ambut. That means I don't know the connection here. All right. Sometimes that's the case. In English, we would say punt, because in football, in American football, you get, 4 chances to push the ball 3 meters. But if you don't do it by the 4th chance, you can kick the ball down the field. That's called a punt. That means I give up. I couldn't do it. So in English, we would say punt. Cebuano will say ambut. But in the textbooks or the reading, you might see formal or miscellaneous or unknown. Sometimes it's too difficult we just aren't sure what the connection is. And as I said, in the prophetic text, often there's no parallelism there. Many times you won't see parallelism at all. So Hebrew poetry does not have to have parallelism, but it often does. All right. So if you're in a psalm, though, typically every verse is going to have parallelism in it. In the Proverbs, almost every verse is going to have some form of parallelism. But there is an occasion, sometimes it happens, it's too difficult to know what that connection is. So you just say, ambut. I have no idea. All right. Okay, so to summarize, these are the different types of Hebrew parallelism. Okay? Synonymous, contrastive, developmental, and there's 3 types of developmental: chiasm and formal, or umbut. All right, so any questions on this? We're going to go through a few examples together before we end our time this morning, but any questions or comments at this point? Umbut? Okay. Let's go through some examples. I will do a couple, and then I'll call on you guys to help me out. We'll do a few of them together. I just chose passages from Proverbs here. So we're going to identify the type of parallelism used in the following passages. And what I'm going to do here is, let me split the page so that on the top you can have, just as a reminder, the different options, and then the bottom will have the passage. Okay. All right, here we go. So I'll do the first couple here. Pride go. Oh, we've already done this actually. So
That's
pride
example.
goes. What's that?
That's the example before.
Yeah, I'm cheating. I'll do the hard ones here. Okay, what could this one be? All right. So notice we have grammatical structure is similar. So we'll just review real quick. We have pride, similar to haughty spirit, and then goes before destruction. So it goes before, and then destruction and stumbling. So this was synonymous parallelism. It's the same idea being presented in the same way. All right, so this is synonymous. All right, let's do a different example. Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all transgressions. So here we have hatred
And love.
and love, looking like it might be contrast, stirs up,
Strive.
all right, versus covers, and then strife and all transgressions. Now this is what's called contrastive, okay, because you're contrasting 2 things here. Hatred stirs up or creates strife, conflict. Love, opposite of hatred, covers transgressions. Now notice strife and transgressions are similar here, but the idea being given is opposite. Right? Hatred stirs up conflict, sin, violence. Love covers it, stops it, prevents it. All right, so it's contrastive. Notice the subject, verb, object, the grammatical structure is the same, but we have a contrast. And here in this case, we have but there as a way to, and the translation shows us that contrast. All right, let me do one more, and then I'll have you guys take it. Proverbs 11:29. He who troubles his own house will inherit wind, and the foolish will be servant to the wise-hearted. Now notice, we don't have the synonymous idea here. He who troubles his own house, okay, is the subject in this one. The foolish is the subject in the second line. Will inherit is the verbal idea. Will be servant to. I like to do this highlight, just it breaks it down. It helps me to see more clearly. Notice these are not two synonymous ideas. He's not saying the same thing twice, and he's not contrasting here. All right, he's talking about he who troubles his own house and the foolish. All right, so he's not contrasting two kinds of people. Will inherit, will be. Those aren't two contrasting verbal ideas. All right, wind and servant. Those aren't. So there's not a contrast. There's not a synonymous. So this is developmental in some way. How is it developing it? Well, notice it seems to be adding to. It's expanding on the first idea. He who troubles his own house will inherit wind, whatever that means. And in addition to that, the foolish will be servant to the wise-hearted.
All the more.
Okay, so the idea here is developmental. The second line is developing the first. The second line is adding, or you could say expanding to the first. Okay, so it's expansion or addition. All right, so that's one type of developmental. All right, so here we go. I'm going to have you guys take it from here. Kazot, you're up first. What kind of parallelism do you see in this? Read the verse and then tell us what kind of parallelism you see.
Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. I think it's developmental.
Okay. Let's break down that, see what the structure looks like. We have her ways as the subject in the first one, right? All her paths, the subject in the second. The verbal idea is our, A-R-E, in both. And then pleasant ways is the object, or the predicate nominative here. Now, it seems like developmental that it's adding to, but notice, is he saying the same thing or something very similar here in both lines?
Synonymous.
Yeah, I think it's synonymous because her ways, her paths are pleasant ways, peace. So each of those is I think the same. He's saying the same thing in the same way or similarly. He's saying something similar in a similar way. So I think synonymous is what we would have here. Now, does that make sense, Kazo? You see that?
Yes, Pastor. Yes, Pastor.
Okay. I know the word and is here. What makes it seem like maybe it's, adding to, but in this case, it's not. And by the way, let me see. Was this Proverbs 3:17? Okay. All right, Kazo, why don't you try one more? Read this verse and then tell us what you think.
The one who guards his mouth preserves his life. The one who opens wide his lips comes to ruin.
Okay, so let's break it down. Let's see if we have anything similar here. Okay, the one who guards his mouth, who opens wide his lips, preserves is the verbal idea, comes to
ruin.
Okay. Does the structure seem similar here?
It's contrastive.
Yes, very good. Grammatically, the structure is very similar. The one who guards his mouth, the one who opens wide his lips, preserves versus comes to. But there's a contrast, life and ruin. Life versus ruin. So this is contrastive parallelism. So the second line is giving a contrast to the first. It's not adding to it. It's not illustrating it. It's saying, giving two opposing, contrasting ideas, each of these two lines. All right, very good. Brother Arn, we're going to give you the next
ask
one.
something.
Oh, question?
May I interrupt?
Yeah, go ahead.
In the Proverbs, we talk about the wisdom as a feminine her, or you listen to her, she called. But in the New Testament, Christ made our wisdom.
Okay. Do you have a question, or is that a?
Yeah, how is the contrast here of in a feminine way before, then Christ is our wisdom. It became wisdom to us.
Yeah, like Colossians speaks of, Christ's wisdom. We have to be careful. In Proverbs, there are some who equate wisdom to Jesus, but we have to be careful with that for a couple of reasons. One, wisdom is personified as a woman in Proverbs. Wisdom is spoken of as if it were a woman. Part of the reason for that is the word wisdom is feminine in Hebrew. Chokmah is a feminine noun in Hebrew. But also, too, that the author there, speaking of wisdom, he talks about Lady Folly and Lady Wisdom early in the Proverbs. So I don't think there's a statement that Jesus is wisdom in the Proverbs. Obviously, Jesus is all wise. He gives us wisdom. God created the world through him. But in Proverbs, he doesn't represent or symbolize wisdom. Wisdom is its own concept, if you will, and it's given to us or personified or described as if it were a female. So don't mix those. Don't mix Christ and wisdom in Proverbs. I don't think, my opinion anyway, is I don't think that's the intent being given there. Does that answer your question, or were you asking something different?
I'm both.
Yeah, I think a lot of people get that confused in Proverbs. It's like, why is wisdom being described as a woman here? Well, it's not being equated to God. God used wisdom in creation, but it's just being personified, like made to be like a person in some cases in Proverbs. But that doesn't mean wisdom is a person. It's just being described that way. And in the Proverbs, it's described as a female. That doesn't mean wisdom is feminine or that women are wiser, though, they probably are. But that's not what the Proverbs statement is making. It's just, you'll see this in Hebrew poetry quite often, this concept of personification. We see passages like the rivers, the trees clap their hands, the mountains shout for joy. Well, mountains don't shout. Trees don't have hands, and they don't clap. The rivers don't roar. There's statements like that too. But those are what are called personifications, which is a poetic way of, if the mountains could shout, you know, remember Jesus, he used personification when in the triumphal entry. You remember the people were praising him and Hosanna, and then the Jews were saying, hey, tell these people to be quiet or we'll get in trouble from the Romans. And Jesus said the rocks would cry out if these people didn't. Well, Jesus wasn't saying the rocks would come alive, and that was a poetic expression to say, look, you know, praise is what is right and appropriate here, and it will happen, to the point that even these rocks would cry out if they could in praise. So personification is a poetic way to enliven or express a particular idea in a unique way that gets the reader's attention. Okay, so by personifying wisdom as a woman and then contrasting her with folly as a woman, that's just a poetic way to you know, express or make a point that he's trying to make about wisdom or foolishness. Okay, long answer to a short question, but we have to be careful, guys, we don't read Jesus into places where he's not obviously there. Obviously, the whole Bible is intended to move us towards understanding who Jesus is and what he has done. The scriptures are about him, but that doesn't mean that he's in every scripture. But we can take the truth of every scripture will ultimately in some way point to Christ. That's the idea. Not that Jesus is in every passage or that every passage is specifically about him, but what it is that when we look at the truth of all the truths of scripture, ultimately they will all point us to the character of Christ, who he is, how we are to respond to him, those kinds of things. But we what's that?
Thank you.
Oh, okay. That's your way of telling me to be quiet, move on. Okay, I will.
Sorry. Sorry.
No. I just want to make sure we remember that. Okay. Let's see. Arn, you're up. This is your verse.
Proverbs 19 verse 8. He who gets wisdom loves his own soul. He who gets understanding will find good. Okay. He and he similar, who gets and who keeps similar.
Yeah, he who gets wisdom. He who keeps
and
understanding.
who keeps understanding similar. Loves his own will find good. Loves and will find. Okay. Para he who keeps, who gets wisdom, understanding, parang synonymous, am I right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a little bit of difference here at the loves and will find good, but loves his own soul and will find good. Those are both beneficial for him, right? So I think in that way, I would say synonymous would be a good Yes. You know, maybe you could say developmental adds,
Developmental.
but these two, loves his own soul and will find good, that those have a similar idea. That's for the benefit of this person. But he who gets wisdom, he who keeps understanding, those are synonymous statements. So I would say synonymous would be my first guess. All right, let's try another one, Arn. How about this one?
Okay. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 1, the wise woman builds her house, but the foolish tears it down with her own hands. The wise and foolish is contrast,
Yes.
then builds and tears contrast,
Yes.
opposite. Her house and her with her own hands is it, Pastor, contrastive?
Yeah. I would say it's contrastive. Because notice the wise woman builds, the foolish tears down. Now the second line does add with her own hands, how. But here again, Sid, we see the idea of ellipsis here. Because notice the second line doesn't have woman in it, right?
Right.
But that's implied because it says her own hands. And we could say the first line really has the same concept as the second, right?
Right.
But this would be awkward and not as poetic to have, you know, the wise woman builds her house with her own hands, but the foolish woman tears it down with her own hands. That's kind of wordy. So the author, I think, takes out a few of these words to shorten it, but the concept is that implied. All right. And we have that word but. All right. So this is contrastive. Contrasting the wise woman, she builds her house. The foolish woman tears down her house.
Because of the word.
Okay. And notice here, by the way, wise woman, it's not personifying wisdom as a woman. It's describing a woman who is wise.
Correct.
Who is foolish. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Good. Very good. Let's see. And Selma, let's give you a try, and then we'll probably call it, finish up with this. So I'm going to try this verse, Proverbs 14:12.
Proverbs 14:12. There is a way which seems right to a man, but it ends in the way of death.
What do you think we have here? What kind of parallelism?
Try to study, sir. There is a way.
Let me do this. What if the proverb had said this? But there is a way which leads to death. What would that be, you think? Right, there's a way.
Or on developmental, sir.
Yeah, this would be contrastive if we had this, but we don't. Actually, the author words it differently. It's not, the structure isn't the same. This is developmental, not contrastive. And what way is it developing? How does line 2
Away,
develop?
sir. Wait.
Huh?
It shows the end of the way.
Yeah,
That seems right.
it's end. It's a key word there. Indicates result, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, line 2 is the result of line 1. The man who takes,
So it's a reason.
huh? A reason? Well, it would be a reason not to go that way. But here I think he's just saying this is the result. The way that seems right to someone can lead to to death. All right. There is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. So I think result is the idea in this one. This one's a little bit tougher. Okay. Go ahead and make sure you guys do the reading this week and last week, and it'll talk about some part of the reading. Will talk about this parallelism and give some more examples. We will look at several more examples next week, and keep practicing this because it's important for us to understand. And then what I would like you to do next week is read Psalm 51 a couple of times, and we're going to go through the parallelism of the whole psalm in that case, okay? Together. We'll have you do it, give you some time to do it, and then we'll come together and talk about it. And I think you'll see some very helpful insights into that psalm just by looking at the parallelism within it, okay? Welcome, Michael. Good morning. It's good to see you.
Morning, Pastor Tim. I'm so sorry for being late because we had a meeting in the core. So
Yeah, no
we,
problem.
we addressed some issues regarding matters in the church. So I'm so sorry for me. Pastor, may I ask if I could talk to you